Hello and welcome to you, our audience here in Toronto and indeed around the world. A special welcome to our U of T alumni joining us today. My name is Claire Kennedy and I'm Senior Advisor at Bennett Jones and Chair of the Governing Council at the University of Toronto. I'm really pleased to be the moderator for tonight's discussion, our first ever virtual Disruptors and Dilemmas panel, entitled The View from 2025, Q1 of the 21st Century. As we approach 2025, today's discussion imagines a first quarterly report on this century and asks, what are we accomplishing and where do we need to change course to improve outcomes and mitigate risk, touching on technology, law, healthcare, and business. In another first for Disruptors and Dilemmas, which originated as a speaker series some of you recall, called Biz School, the engineering faculty has teamed up with the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law, the Rotman School of Management, and the Temerty Faculty of Medicine to bring you a truly multidisciplinary panel here this evening. Before I very briefly introduce our panelists, though, I am going to invite Professor Chris Yip, Dean of our host faculty, the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering, to make a few introductory remarks. Chris, over to you.
Great, thanks, Claire. So great to see so many of you joining us this evening from around the world on what I think is a record-setting event for us here at Disruptors and Dilemmas. Our topic tonight asks you to imagine a future that is really just a little bit different from the world as it is today. Just 5 years from now, we're going to be a quarter of the way through the 21st century, and really enough time to see whether some of our predictions have come to pass or not. As you know, right now, many of our professors, students, and alumni are really developing the technologies that will shape the world, our world, and us for decades to come, whether it's autonomous vehicles, advanced medical technologies, cleaner forms of energy, new materials, all things which are going to be extremely important and impactful going forward. It's hard to say what's going to be mature in 2025, but we do know is that our students, the ones that are coming through our system now, are going to be, we're preparing them to be tomorrow's leaders. Through our programs such as the ISTEP, our Institute for Studies in Transdisciplinary Engineering Education and Practice, our Troost Institute for Leadership Education Engineering, and our Center for Global Engineering, we're training our students to develop their potential and really excel on the international stage. You'll see that in our excellent panel that's here tonight. As Claire mentioned, Disruptors and Dilemmas started in U of T Engineering as Biz School, but we're really pleased to bring together this really powerful collaboration across 4 faculties: engineering, our friends at the Faculty of Law, the Rotman School of Management, and the Temerty Faculty of Medicine. A real testament to the highly interdisciplinary, interconnected roles that we all play together on campus. The fact we're all really working together now, and something I'm excited to continue to grow going forward. I think this is a terrific opening for what's sure to be a continued collaboration. I want to thank again everyone who has made tonight possible. Claire, for founding the series actually more than 10 years ago. It seems that you're shaking your head. It's 10 years ago now, continue to expand its vision to meet the evolving needs of our alumni and our partners. In fact, to bring together this idea of the 4 different faculties, which is terrific. And of course, our presenting sponsor, Bennett Jones, for their continued support of the Disruptors, our virtual Disruptors and Dilemmas events. Hopefully, we will get back to an in-person version soon enough. So with that, let's get started. I'm really excited to hear the conversation.
Great, thank you, Chris. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get right into the panel. Given the size of our audience, we have disabled the video and mic functions and also the raise hand functions, but we do want to have a really robust Q&A session in this panel. And we invite you to submit your questions through the chat function. I would ask you to please reserve the chat for the Q&A and not to have sidebar conversations so that we can stay focused on answering as many of your questions as possible. But now let me turn to the panel. In the interest of time, you should have received an email earlier today with the full bios of our distinguished speakers and their extensive accomplishments. But just quickly, let me tee up by way of introduction a few remarks on Brett Belchett, a double graduate from the Temerty Faculty of Medicine. Brett is the co-founder and CEO of the virtual healthcare app Maple and a practicing emergency room physician for the Scarborough Health Network. Welcome, Brett.
Thank you.
Jutta Brunet is the Metcalf Chair in Environmental Law at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. Rather, she holds that chair. She is a global authority in public international law, international environmental law, and international legal theory. In 2020, Professor Brunet was appointed University Professor, which is U of T's highest and most distinguished academic rank. Welcome, Jutta.
Thanks, Claire. Glad to be here.
Next is Tim Chan, who holds the Canada Research Chair in Novel Optimization and Analytics in Health. He serves as a director of the Center for Healthcare Engineering and the Center for Analytics and AI Engineering, and is a professor in the Department of Mechanical and Industrial Engineering. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
Great. And now Dilip Soman, who holds the Canada Research Chair in Behavioral Science and Economics and serves as a director of BEAR, the Behavioral Economics in Action Research Center at the Rotman School of Management. Dilip's research is in the area of behavioral science and its applications to consumer well-being, marketing, and policy. Welcome, Dilip.
Thank you, Claire. Fantastic to be here.
Great. It's going to be a really interesting discussion. So I'm going to start off with a couple of framing questions for each of our panelists. Then I'll come to some individually directed questions. And then, as I said, I really want to open this up to audience Q&A. So audience members, remember to direct your questions into the chat. But in the meantime, a couple of framing questions. Here we are in November of 2020. We're 4 years and 21 days away from the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. Hard to imagine in some ways, but let's imagine that it's early 2025 and we are about to publish a quarterly report complete with MD&A, or management's discussion and analysis, as public companies do every quarter. So to each of our panelists, what would be some of the major messages in this first quarter report in your view? Both in terms of achievements, but also risks. I'm going to go to you, Dilip, first on this.
Okay, thank you. So this is a great question. And I think you mentioned it's already, gosh, almost 2025. I still remember waking up on the 1st of January, 2000 and happy about the fact that Y2K didn't actually exist. It wasn't a thing. And when I think back of the time that I got my undergrad degree in engineering many years ago, the fact that I was working with dot matrix printers and my programs were on these punch cards that you would take to the mainframe. And once I accidentally stumbled and fell down and had to redo the whole thing. Gosh, we've come a long way. And I think the accomplishments are easy to list. Obviously, technology, the internet. On the internet, though, I mean, I think it's been 25 years since a book called The Death of Distance was written. It took us a pandemic for us to fully realize the value of the death of distance. So I find that interesting. But in general, ICT, innovations in supply chain, machine learning, I mean, there's a lot we can celebrate. I'm going to focus on three negatives, if I may. And so three things that I wish we had done a better job of. The first one is the notion of long-termism, or the absence of long-termism. So every company that I work with, every government that I speak to wants to be long-term focused, but they're not. And one of the big challenges is, how do we actually get organizations to be long-term focused? Because if we can do that, we can solve a lot of the major challenges that we are faced with: climate change, poverty, so on and so forth. So why is there a big mismatch between intention and action? I guess the fact that we're still doing quarterly reports has something to do with it. And so it's kind of ironic that we're doing a quarterly report, but every year, every organization files a quarterly report. There's always a tension between the short-term check marks on that report versus longer-term plans. I think we need to go back and look at that a little bit. As a result of the quarterly report culture, we tend to be focused in a culture of problem solving as opposed to a culture of designing new things. I think that's the one thing that holds us back. But it also shows up in other ways. So for example, our financing models for innovation, I think, have been fantastic. However, they tend to favor a certain kind of innovation. So for example, there's a wonderful book written by a sociologist in Chicago by the name of Galenson. And he talks about two different forms of innovation. There's innovations that peak early, and there are innovators that take their time in getting to their peak. And so for example, in the world of painting, Picasso, I mean, was amazingly young when his most famous painting was sold. And Cezanne, on the other hand, had to wait till the ripe old age of 46 before his most famous painting became famous. And so I worry that by the current model of financing that we're adopting, we tend to favor the Picassos of the world. We tend to favor the shiny new things as opposed to the small incremental changes. So I think that's one thing I worry about a lot, and we can do a lot better. The second big thing I want to focus on is inequality. And I want to start us off by recognizing a book written by a famous economist who was the federal chairman of the Indian Reserve Bank, Raghuram Rajan. He wrote a book called The Third Pillar. He talked about the fact that there are three pillars that are essential to successfully move civilization forward: the state, the markets, and the communities. And I would argue that we've done pretty well with the state, and we've done very well with markets. We've left communities behind. And in order to ensure the success of markets, we've created a world where the rich get richer at the expense of the poor. Communities diverge in terms of the haves and the have-nots. And that's a little bit dangerous. We're also pushing a culture where some of us are making decisions that will affect others. And particularly in the context of poverty, we don't involve the poor in decision-making about poverty policy, which I find a bit worrying. This is true for the first world versus the third world, the global north versus the global south. And in poverty in particular, we need to keep in mind that poverty creates not just economic hardships for the poor, but also cognitive hardships. I mean, if you have to worry about where your next meal is going to come from, you end up making a series of suboptimal decisions. And we tend to add weight, we tend to add restrictions and hurdles to all of our welfare programs with the belief that if people really want them, they'll work hard towards getting it. And in doing so, we precisely disadvantage the people who would most benefit from those programs. And then the last thing I'm going to touch on for now is the notion of human centricity. And I think in our desire as organizations to be efficient and have streamlined processes, we've lost humanity. We've replaced our customers with dashboards. We've replaced our employees with competence kits. We've lost that general sense of connectedness. I mean, even human resource departments, they even have the word human in their name. They're not designed for humans. They're designed for robots. And so we require citizens to take the initiative to remember things, to wade through complex information, just to have healthy lives and just to have insurance and just to have enough money for retirement. And I think we've just been very reductionist with humans, and I think we need to do a lot better there. One quick thought, I think in the world of financial well-being, there's a lot of movement towards financial literacy, which I find baffling because we first make the financial landscape incredibly complex, and then we have to teach people how to deal with it. Why not just simplify the landscape? So let me stop there and turn it over back to you.
Great. Thank you. A lot in that answer, Dilip. And you touched on short-termism versus long-termism. And I'm going to guess that Jutta might have some perspectives to share on that phenomenon. But let me come to you now, Jutta. What would be your major messages in this Q1 report?
Right. Well, first of all, I think I need to talk more with Dilip to figure out how we deal with this short-term versus long-term dilemma. But stepping back a little bit, I'd say looking at the time frame that you've given us to think about, I'd say from an international perspective, the first 15 years of the new century, we seem to be harvesting the fruits of the new world order, at least what people in the West assumed was emerging after the Cold War. Now, specifically in my area of expertise, international law, I'd say one of the achievements in this period was palpable progress in international law. Let me just give you 3 concrete examples. The adoption of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change in 2015, the creation of the International Criminal Court in 2002, and then also the launching of the WTO, consolidating, if you will, a kind of rules-based order for global trade and investment. But, and I guess I'd also tend more to the grain of salt here, or several of them, I'd say that these achievements in many respects sat on clay feet. And by that, I mean that there was a certain amount of Western hubris, that is the assumption that Western values and goals were global and would sweep the world. Meanwhile, changing geopolitics made it harder actually for the West to ignore the fact that this was not actually the case. Plus, the West proved vulnerable, it turned out, to the backlash that we've all experienced since, let's say, 2016 against international law, globalization, among other things. And that backlash, I think, actually put at risk all 3 of these achievements that I've mentioned and many others as well. Let me again just single out one of them, the US withdrawal, and then the ensuing loss of momentum on climate action. So the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement slowed the global response to the biggest risk we face. And I think it is fair to say we live in a climate emergency. We're not just looking at climate change. This is a climate emergency. And that is precisely the sort of language that might help us possibly to deal with this long-term, short-term issue that we've already heard about. But the crux of the matter is that there is a rapidly closing window for us to correct course on greenhouse gas emissions and avert temperature increases that could set off rapid and irreversible climate change. And we are already approaching a number of tipping points, scientists tell us. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Great, thank you, Jutta. So the quarterly report would say we were ticking along nicely, at least thought we were for the first 15 years, but perhaps we didn't really do a very good job of analyzing the risks, and they have actually started to come to fruition, more than started in some cases, and we're now in an era of very significant uncertainty. Let me switch gears a little bit. I want to come to you, Brett. Can you share with us your perspective on the major messages in this Q1 report?
So I would say the biggest achievements of the first 20 years of this century are all around mobile connectivity, mobile technology. I think never in the history of mankind have we ever lived in an era where humanity is as connected at all times and in all places. I think back to the year I graduated from medical school, which was the year 2000. And I think about the trip that I took to celebrate my graduation. I backpacked around Southeast Asia, and the world was a very different place. I remember getting lost. I don't remember the last time I got lost ever in years, because we have global mapping everywhere that we go on our device. I remember bringing guidebooks stuffed top to bottom in my backpack, because when you were out and you weren't sitting physically at a computer with internet-based guides, you had no idea where restaurants were, and you had no idea where attractions were. And so you had maps and guidebooks and all of these things. If you wanted to get food or know what a restaurant was, order anything or do banking, again, you might have to go to a physical internet cafe to communicate with home. So we take for granted that we now live in a world where we're never lost. We have the entire world of information and connectivity with all of our social and professional networks at hand. No matter where we are, we can work from anywhere in the world. This is truly transformative. And some of the incredible power of this and why this is such a great achievement, especially when I think in the world of healthcare, which is a world that I'm deeply involved in, there are large parts of the developing world now in places like India, in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the world where people had no access to communications or contact with the outside world on a reliable basis whatsoever. And we have built incredible mobile telephony networks, high-speed connectivity for residents of these parts of the world that just didn't ever exist. And so the benefits of that is that we are able to connect these populations with the outside world, but not only that, we're able to deliver services like healthcare that were never possible. We have telemedicine initiatives that connect residents of entire countries in Western Africa with doctors whenever they need them. And many of these communities in the past would have had to travel hundreds of kilometers or even further to have access to any type of medical care. And similarly, they have access to medical care and expertise from potentially other parts of the world that is of a higher caliber than what's available in their local communities. And that would never have been available before. So truly transformative change, and transformative change in a way that if you look at what's happening around the world, there are more people with access to better levels of healthcare and education, et cetera, than ever have existed before. Now, the flip side, the big risks are that we now have created a society where, number one, there is more awareness of inequality than has ever existed before, and that leads to strife, that leads to revolution, that leads to social discord, and that is certainly a big risk. The other big problem is that if we go back in time, we've created a world now where in the past, it was very clear that the only people that had a platform were trusted individuals. So for you to be able to have a voice that would reach everybody out there in the world, you needed to be somebody who was a journalist at a well-respected newspaper or a journalist at a well-respected news network. And that's not the case now. Anybody can have a platform, and the truth of what they say on that platform, there is no way to verify that. And so we're in a very dangerous time now because we're starting to emerge into an era where untruth actually is treated on a very similar level to truth. And so, especially when I look at healthcare, this is very dangerous. We've seen the danger of this in politics, but even in healthcare, where the platform given to anti-vaxxers, which just never existed in the past, they would never have had the opportunity to reach millions or billions of people. They can now do that. And it's very difficult for those of us in the healthcare profession to combat all of the disinformation out there. And so we find it very difficult to potentially get people vaccinated, very difficult in the era of COVID-19 to make sure that people are actually obeying some of just the common sense health advice, like wear a mask. That is very difficult because disinformation has an equal platform to information. So I think one of the really important things we're going to have to figure out as we go forward is we have made so many strides over hundreds of years in terms of the triumph of factual evidence and science, and that's what's brought us so far forward. And we really risk losing all of that if we don't figure out a way to allow people to have a clear way to differentiate between what's true and what's not true, what is fact, what is science versus just what is made up information.
Yeah, I think you hit on a really good point. I think it's the paradox of our age that people have never been more connected. We have this extraordinary technology, in the palm of just about every hand all around the world. And yet we see these crisis in belonging and deaths in despair. And in the political arena, kind of silos. So this absence of real connection and common understanding, and I think it's driving some dangerous trends in our society. So maybe we'll have an opportunity to loop back to that. But I want to come to you now, Tim. Give us your perspective on major messages in this first quarter report.
Sure. I think some of my thoughts will echo a lot of what's already been said. And first of all, I will say it is a bit hard to remember back to what 2000 was like. It really was a long time ago. We're talking Y2K, as Dilip mentioned. We're talking the world pre 9/11. But I would say, echoing some of what Brett said, some of the major achievements I would really think about from a technological perspective in terms of the rise of the internet, social media, to be truthful, before 2000, there was some amount of social happenings on the internet, right? I remember going onto chat rooms with my 14.4 modem and Windows 95 and so on. But these days it's much more sophisticated, and it's not punch cards still, but it's a little bit beyond that. It affects how we get our news. It affects what shows we watch. It affects who we become or stay friends with, and possibly who we vote for. Right. So that's one thing. And the ubiquity of mobile communication now, as Brett mentioned, right, we've got little supercomputers in our pockets, which incidentally also make phone calls. And I would say just generally the democratization of data and information has been a huge game changer in the last 20, 25 years. But with all of these achievements, there are clearly associated risks. There is no free lunch, as you would say, right? So at no prior time in our history have we had easier access to information, yet we have also, I would say, never had a harder time discerning fact from fiction, exactly as as Brett mentioned. And I mean, we're talking about disinformation, we're talking about misinformation. It's very hard now these days to separate out the signal from the noise. And so we might get led down a path where we end up in an echo chamber and that reinforces rather than expands what we know and believe. So not to dwell on the points that have already been made, but just one other thing here would be, there's a lot of experience and evidence about how technology can also contribute to feelings of depression and isolation, and it's a vector for bullying and harassment. So as much as technology can bring us together and advance our society as it has leaps and bounds over the last couple of decades, I think there's also a very strong potential for a negative impact. I don't think there's any question about that.
Good, well said, and a lot to continue our conversation. So I want to come to the second framing question because we are in 2020, but that does mean that we've got 4 years and a bit until the end of the first quarter. So we still have time to make some, changes, to make some improvements. So I want to ask you, and I'm going to go in reverse order. So I'm going to come back to you right away with this one, Tim. Is, in your view, what's one thing? So let's be tight, let's be focused here. What is one thing that we are not doing now that we could be doing in the next 4 years? So this has to be something that is technologically feasible now or very near term, sort of not really, really blue sky type of stuff. But what's that one thing, in your view, that we could be doing in the next 4 years that would materially improve what I'm going to call our Q1 operating results? And I'll invite you to make it a little bit harder. I'll invite you to say what you would be willing to give up or trade off to achieve that. So let's try and make this a speed round, just a couple of minutes per person. I'm going to go to you, Tim.
Okay, sure. I mean, I think the big elephant in the room is COVID. I mean, given that we're still in the grips of the pandemic, I'd say as a society, we need to work together and fight this off so we can return as quickly as possible to normal or the new normal. And so that means doing whatever you can to avoid contracting and spreading the virus, keeping your family and friends and neighbors safe. I apologize if this sounds like a PSA, that's not the intention, but the quicker that we can fight this off and the quicker that we can resume regularly scheduled programming. As you're aware, we are facing lots of trade-offs in our fight against COVID. I think if we can beat it, we will have a material, probably the biggest impact that we can in terms of ending Q1 on a positive note. But I think one of the hardest trade-offs to make is perhaps one of the smallest, and that I think is one of personal sacrifice, because it's hard to see how me and my individual or my little sacrifice could impact the whole, right? And now perhaps as an example, now this might be a minor sacrifice to some, but it saddens me to think that I won't be able to see my parents or my wife's parents for the foreseeable future because they don't live in Toronto. And they're missing out on many of the formative years or these moments that they could be spending with their grandkids and watching them develop. But I think this is a sacrifice we have to make. We have to trust the scientific expertise that is guiding us, trust that our individual actions will add up to a bigger whole. And I recognize that it's difficult to say that we're all going to equally sacrifice, because I don't think that's true. And I think it's clear that COVID is not affecting everybody equally. And I don't have a good answer for this, but I think it's clear that we do need to find an equitable way to frame our collective actions against COVID and over the next year or two, if we really want to come out of this quarter a healthier and stronger society.
Yeah, well said, Tim. Let me come to you now, Brett.
I think the priority, and this probably won't come as a surprise based on what I said before, but I think the priority for us over the next 4 years or 5 years is really figuring out a way to accurately distinguish truth from misinformation. And this has been discussed quite extensively in lots of forums. How do we do this? And there's been lots of different suggestions, and none of them are perfect, but I think we all can acknowledge that when there is a battle, for instance, between two pieces of information, one of which is telling us that the world is flat and one of which is telling us that the world is round, we all can agree that one is true and one is false. There is, despite all of the evidence to the contrary, there is a universal idea of what is true, what is fact, what is provable. And we have to figure out how to reestablish that out in our media, in our social networks, in the places where people are gathering news. Because I think so long as misinformation is triumphing, we're not going to be able to beat any of the challenges we're facing. We're not beating COVID because there is so much misinformation around the basic health hygiene things that we need to do to keep this contained. We're not going to beat COVID even with a vaccine because there is so much misinformation about vaccines. When you see surveys actually showing that a huge, substantial percentage of our population would actually refuse a vaccine even if it were available today because of the misinformation. We're not going to beat climate change because of all the misinformation. So I think the number one thing we have to figure out is how to address misinformation out there in our global communication networks so that then we can successfully address all of those other challenges we face. And I think if you ask me what I'm personally willing to give up, I'm personally willing to give up my ability to have the right to trumpet anything I want out into the global information networks, whether it's true or not. I think we have this incredible freedom of speech where we can say anything whatsoever, even if it's a complete lie, even if it's a complete fallacy. And I'm willing to give that up. I'm willing to recognize that in order for us to have some amount of fact and information versus misinformation, we all will have some amount of checking that occurs on the things that we say for whether or not they're true or not. So we'll have to figure out, there's a lot of complexity for how we do that. I don't have the answer, but I think this is the path we have to go down if we're going to have meaningful impact against any of these crises that we're facing right now.
Yeah. I definitely hear you on the misinformation, and there's certainly a lot of talk today about regulatory responses to this and sort of regulating big tech, and you're seeing some of the platforms make attempts at doing this. But coming back to the point maybe that Tim was making about sort of personal sacrifice, one thing each of us could do would be to make ourselves sort of less susceptible to the outrage machine, which is, I think, what is driving a lot of the misinformation. Because I think there are a lot of sort of tricky trade-offs in a policy or regulatory response to something like this. But each of us could take some personal responsibility for likes or forwards or amplifying the kinds of misinformation that is floating out there. I'll say that I'm certainly in favor of what I've called slow news. And I think if we slowed down the pace at which we acquired news, we would all be healthier for it. But I digress. Jutta, let me come to you now. What's one thing that we're not doing now that we could be doing in the next 4 years? And what would you be willing to give up to achieve that?
Right. Well, I want to come back to the rapidly closing window that I mentioned earlier. And actually, on the brighter side of things, it seems to me that we may have a fairly unique chance right now to make up for lost time. And that is due to two coinciding circumstances. And the first one is the incoming Biden administration, which we can expect will return the United States to the Paris Agreement. And what that means is that all major emitters in the world, all major emitters will have made a commitment to be carbon neutral, that is to have net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the middle of the century. Now that brings us back to the issue that Dilip raised about the long-term, short-term. That seems a long way away. It seems very tempting to say, well, somebody else is going to deal with that. It's good for us to make this commitment now. It looks good, but the key thing is it means acting now in this time frame that you've set for us in the next 4 or 5 years. We need to make concerted efforts in order to have any chance of getting there. The second circumstance that might possibly help us is, in fact, the COVID pandemic. It may turn out to be a kind of a saving grace. That is obviously something one should not say lightly, but in this context, it's taught us all sorts of things. Some of them have already come up. So for example, it's taught us that when we all act together with seemingly small things, we can make a big difference, but also we need to act together to make those things happen. It's taught us about curves and assessing what happens if we do something now, what are the longer term effects, and so on. But most of all, it gives us a chance, I think, to double down and get serious on this often mentioned green recovery. And so to your question, what should we collectively give up on? I think we need to give up on our cutback on fossil fuel subsidies. That's not an easy thing to say in Canada, but it's said by major economists around the world. And personally, that takes me to where Timothy was. This is the first year, I have to say, in about 30 years where I have been in an airport only once, coming back from Vancouver at the beginning of January. I fly a lot, in part for family reasons, part for professional reasons, but I think we've learned that we can do a lot of things without flying places. So I think for me personally, trying to cut back on flying would be one of the sacrifices that I think I need to make.
Interesting, interesting. Let me come to you, Dilip, to close out this speed round in terms of something we're not doing now that we could be doing in the next 4 years that would materially improve our Q1 results.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on a theme or a word that you use, the slow news. And I think there's an equivalent in the innovation world, in the discovery world, which is slow innovation. We've forgotten about that. We're all in a hurry to produce shiny new things. I think we need to slow down as a society. And I think the one way in which we can do that is to keep in mind that at the end of the day, we produce products, we produce programs, we produce innovations, not for the sake of the innovation, but for the sake of some behavior change at the end. We want to get people to wear a mask. We want to get people to have secure retirements. And I think we tend to forget that. Right? We tend to forget that at the end of this innovation pipeline is a human being. And so we assume that they know what's good for them. And we assume that they're going to comply with instructions. And we assume that they will digest copious amounts of information and make the right decision. So I'd say as long as we keep in mind as designers that we're designing for humans and not for robots or econs or these fictional creatures that live on the pages of economics textbooks, that would be a big win right there. So if you're designing a financial literacy program, I think we should assume that people don't recognize the importance of saving for retirement. Just because you think they should doesn't mean that they should. And in anything, I mean, when we design retirement programs, we should assume that people will forget to do stuff. We should assume that people don't know what it means to rebalance a portfolio. It could be anything. It could be vaccinations, right? I mean, I'm a behavioral scientist, so I like to always give the benefit of doubt to humans. And just because we have anti-vaxxers, they've been misled. It's not like they're stupid. And I think we need to recognize that. And so we need to fight, as Brett said, not the people who are anti-vaxxers, but the phenomena that causes anti-vax sentiment, right? And so I think, to me, that would be a huge win if we move to a slower rate of innovation and a more human-centric approach to innovation. I'd be happy to give up lots of things. I'd be happy to give up a lot of shiny new toys. I don't want to go to the Apple store every 6 months. And then, as everybody else spoke about, like things like travel or things that we sort of grew up believing were the essence of our society. We're learning to give them up, and we're learning that it's not all bad to not meet your friends every day and to not be in the same building as your colleagues every day, and still work gets done. So I think it's to me, if we just slow down, take it easy, understand what our goals are, and as Yuta says, understand what the long-term consequences of our short-term actions are, we'll be in a better place.
Yeah, step back and take that broader perspective. I'm a fan of the phrase "slow is smooth, smooth is fast," and so maybe we need to slow down before we can speed up. I'm going to come to some individually directed questions now, and just a reminder to our audience: if you want to participate in the Q&A by sending in questions, and I see some are coming in thick and fast already, please do so through the chat function. So I'm going to go through these individually directed questions, and then I'm going to ask you to keep your answers crisp so we do have time to get to our audience Q&A. Yuta, I'm going to start with you. You're an expert in international environmental law. And as you touched upon, transnational environmental regulation seems to be the quintessential collective action problem. So we would all be better off if we coordinated what we were doing, but there are conflicting interests and frankly benefits to be gained in some cases individually by not aligning. And here I'm talking about nations, but I think this phenomenon applies at the individual level. But in that context, talk to us about how environmental law is tackling this collective action problem. And then I'm going to have a quick follow-up for you to extrapolate on some broader context.
Right, yeah, so I think that question tees up perfectly to say a few more words about the Paris Agreement, which really is an effort to tackle a fiendishly complex collective action problem. I always say tackling climate change is about changing the way we do virtually everything that we do. So it's not just one pollutant, it's almost everything. And the challenge for international law, among many things, is that sovereign states have to consent to bind themselves to international obligations, for example, to emission cuts. And that means oftentimes that if you don't get consent, you don't get any action at all, or you don't get the key players involved. That was the problem with the Paris Agreement's predecessor, the Kyoto Protocol. It had binding emission cut commitments, but no China, no India, no United States, and Canada withdrew at a certain point. Or else you get the lowest common denominator. And so the Paris Agreement was a fundamental rethink of approach, something that doesn't happen all that often, but here it did. And the big shifts that were made was that it took international environmental law from what had been called a top-down approach, that is negotiated commitments, to a bottom-up approach, and the idea of so-called nationally determined contributions, which also meant that there was a shift from binding emission cut commitments to guiding principles in the treaty, temperature goals, certain normative expectations. For example, the idea that there would be a ratcheting up from the initial lower common denominator, and all of that coupled with international accountability and transparency. In 2015, Margaret Wente, as she was still writing for the Globe and Mail, compared the Paris Agreement to a sort of planetary Weight Watchers. She said that making voluntary commitments was kind of silly. She said it was like saying, I quote, that I aim to lose 100 pounds on my current diet of croissants and brie minus a crumb or two. Oh no, make that 120 pounds. Very catchy, but ultimately wrong. And I'm happy to say more about that, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, so a quick follow-up then on that. So that bottom-up approach of the Paris Accord, which marked a departure from prior attempts at negotiation, is there something in that framework that we can learn about conducting effective multilateral negotiations outside climate? Because it seems that there's actually no shortage of vexing issues where some international coordination would help. Trade, obviously a lot of trade tensions today, that's very much in the headlines, refugees and migration, and of course now pandemic response. So help us understand a little bit about what we can take from this Paris Accord process that has worked, but maybe also what we could learn from the failures. Just quickly on that, help us understand how we could apply this more broadly.
Right. So the reason why I think that Margaret Wente's commentary was ultimately wrong is it might seem counterintuitive, but I think the Paris Agreement approach actually has it right for dealing with a complex problem like climate change, because one has to get domestic buy-in, right? If only, as we've just seen in the last few years, to kind of backlash-proof global action. Second thing is adaptability is ultimately more important than binding force, I would suggest. And these nationally determined commitments can be very quickly adapted if need be, because they don't have to be negotiated or renegotiated internationally. And then also, I think credible signal setting and momentum building is more important ultimately than penalties. So there are, I think, lessons for other global issues here. One lesson I would say is that this doesn't necessarily mean actually that the Paris Agreement approach is right for every other issue, because one size does not fit all. So the reason that the Paris Agreement rethink happened was that it turned out that the formula that one had used for decades in international environmental law did not work for climate change, therefore rebuild it. And so the Paris Agreement works for this issue, but I'm not sure that it necessarily would work for all others. But what it does show us is that spending time negotiating an agreement with binding obligations may not be the right approach for complexity, although it may ironically be the right approach for trade agreements. But again, I'll just leave that hanging and we can come back to that if there's interest.
Great, lots there. Thank you, Jutta. Tim, I'm going to go to you now. You hold the Canada Research Chair in Novel Optimization Analytics in Health, and you have a research focused in machine learning. We've already had a lot of questions into the chat on AI. So let me ask you, have you talked to us about what advances in machine learning enabled, let's stick with healthcare, but if you wanna go beyond that, feel free. What advances do you think that we're gonna experience between now and the end of Q1? And then I'm gonna invite you to really sort of speculate a bit and look into Q2, so 2025 to 2049. Help us understand the landscape here.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think we can think about advances as being of two types. So those that we can see and feel, right, you know, or and those that we can't. So if I start with the latter category, you know, there are lots of behind the scenes advances that are happening right now that are being integrated into routine hospital operations or clinical care. But as patients, we probably wouldn't even know about, we wouldn't realize are happening. So for example, you know, lots of discussion around advances in radiology, where we might be able to read images more quickly, detect abnormalities using machine learning, or maybe using machine learning to discover new drugs. You'll benefit from those findings. You might take those drugs, but you might not ever be aware that it was a particular therapeutic candidate that was discovered using, excuse me, using machine learning in the first place. I'll give you a very concrete example of this. I do research in an area known as radiation therapy for cancer. So we develop optimization and machine learning models to help design radiation therapy treatments. And I have a collaborator who works at Princess Margaret Hospital, really a thought leader in this area. And he's developed a machine learning based automated treatment planning system that's been licensed to a company and is actually, and that company sells software to hundreds of hospitals around the world. So there are now patients receiving treatments for cancer that were essentially designed by a machine, by an algorithm, and obviously, you know, with some human oversight, of course. But you know, people would never know that it was, let's say, a machine designing a treatment rather than a human manually coming up with it. On the flip side, if we go to things that we can see directly, you know, coming back to the supercomputer in your hands, for example, right, our smartphones. I mean, many of you may already be interacting with your doctor via an app. I'm sure Brett can talk a lot more about this. You know, this app may help you schedule appointments intelligently, might help you with a diagnosis. It might give you automated reminders. We have smartwatches and wearables now that can monitor physiological signals, possibly detect adverse events ahead of time or provide feedback to you in terms of health and wellness, or maybe an optimal course of training, say, if you're an athlete and exercising. If I can look ahead a little bit into Q2 and what some of the things we might expect are, you know, going forward, you know, I like to imagine a world in the next 25 years where we will really exist in an integrated healthcare environment. So data-driven, analytics-driven, optimized for the patient, the provider, and the system simultaneously. I know that's a lot to ask for, but I think we are making progress along all of these dimensions. And so one example we're living through this very second in terms of virtual care. I mean, basically all of life is virtual now. We're living in one big video game, right? The Matrix. But COVID has really sped up the adoption of virtual everything and virtually everything, right? And so I think we're going to see a lot more virtual healthcare encounters. There's already a lot of that happening now. I think that will provide better and more equitable access to healthcare down the road to people who might not otherwise have healthcare because they live in a remote region, for example. Maybe one other example before I pass off, another concrete innovation that might not be as far off as we think in terms of integrating cutting edge technology with healthcare. I'm part of a team right now led by a collaborator who's developing drones to deliver defibrillators to cardiac arrest patients. So they're doing pilot studies for this out in rural parts of Ontario. They're actually, the initial tests and results have been quite promising. And whether we're ready or not, I think we're going to see drones, for example, zipping across the skies, delivering medical supplies and life-saving equipment and so on. This is already happening in other parts of the world where maybe from a regulatory perspective, it's a little bit easier to pilot and implement. But anyway, this stuff is happening, I think, sooner than we think. And all of this is going to be driven by data, and all of this is going to be driven by the analytics on that data. So maybe I'll pause there.
Wow, lots to digest there. And so drones delivering medical supplies are not as blue sky as we might have thought. I'm going to stick with healthcare, and I'm going to come to you, Brett, but we're going to shift focus a little bit away from technology and maybe to some more sort of policy issues to talk about, because Canadians, I think, really are rightly proud of our universal healthcare system, but maybe to a fault, maybe so much so that we are unwilling to consider how we might change that system to improve outcomes, reduce wait times, and lower costs. There's a report out today, you've probably seen that, indicating that Canada is near the top of the list in terms of cost of our healthcare system, I think second only to Switzerland, but kind of middle of the pack, and in some cases below average on a bunch of different outcomes. So what do you think that we need to do to innovate in the delivery of medical care while maintaining universal access that I think is so important? And could you comment for us on what the social or policy impediments, so not so much the technological limitations, but what are the social or policy impediments that you see that we need to overcome?
So I think we're in a very unique situation here in Canada, in that we live in the shadow of the giant United States, which I think everybody in the developed world would agree probably has one of the most dysfunctional healthcare systems in the world. And they live in the shadow of us. And I think we have possibly the second most dysfunctional healthcare system in the world when you look at some of the international studies. So there's organizations like the Commonwealth Fund that comes out of Washington, D.C. And what they do is every few years, they look at all of the healthcare systems across the developed world and compare them on a number of metrics like access to care, effectiveness of care, mortality rates, perinatal mortality, and all these other things that really matter to show, is a healthcare system actually working for patients? And so what we see routinely over and over and over again, when we look at all of the countries that they compare, typically the worst performing healthcare system in the developed world is usually the United States, weighed down by what the experience is for people without insurance. If you were only to look at well-insured people in the United States, it's actually much better. But once you average it out for that overall population, it is a bit of a catastrophic performance. And what's really interesting is routinely over and over again, the second worst healthcare system in the developed world is us. Every other healthcare system tends to do better in terms of wait times, access to care, mortality rates, cost of providing healthcare, et cetera. And so what's really interesting to look at is that when you look at all of these healthcare systems from Canada, the United States, Western Europe, the Pacific Rim, et cetera, Australia, New Zealand, there's only one healthcare system that really has no universal healthcare system, and that's the United States. They are the only system that does not have some form of universal coverage for everybody, where you can, by virtue of not having enough money, potentially not get treated. Canada is actually, interestingly, the only country in the developed world that has no private option for healthcare. So we pride ourselves on universality, but we pride ourselves on universality to such an extent, and I think this is an adverse reaction to what we've seen in the United States, to such an extent that we've actually banned the private provision of healthcare because we've seen all of what it's done terribly in the United States. So we're in this terrible situation where we here in Canada, we say there's no way we can ever allow private healthcare, because look at the disaster next door in the United States. And in the United States, they say, well, we can never have universal healthcare because look at the disaster next door in Canada. And so both of us are sitting as the bottom two performers in the world with this horribly myopic view of what the other possibilities are. And so when we look at what's happening in the rest of the world, so all of Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, et cetera, we see really, really excellent examples of hybrid healthcare systems where there's an incredibly effective universal healthcare system where everybody is covered. Systems like the NHS in the United Kingdom, and my wife is French, and they have an incredible French universal healthcare system where absolutely everybody gets taken care of. But yet, in parallel, there are private healthcare systems in all of these countries, and these have actually proven to be far more effective. So if you look at all of the metrics in all of these other countries, the wait times are lower. And even for those people who are in the public universal healthcare system, they're outperforming our universal healthcare system. The cost to provide care is lower. The ability to adopt innovation is better. We tend to keep the public healthcare system honest because right next to it is the private healthcare system. So for instance, in the United Kingdom, they regularly conduct audits to say what are the wait times in the private system versus the public system, and where the public system is underperforming, the public system is held to task to say you can do better. we accept wait times of 6 to 12 months for some specialist care here in Canada. We accept wait times of 6 to 12 months or greater for many surgeries like a hip replacement or a knee replacement here in Canada. We accept it because there is no other option. There's nothing to compare that to. So when we see what's happening in these other countries, actually, we see much better metrics. So I think all this being said, I think the path we've gone down in healthcare in Canada, we look at this as this is what makes us Canadian. This is forever Canadian. In fact, that's not the case. The Canada Health Act is relatively recent. It was introduced in 1984. So this is the act that actually prohibits any provision of private healthcare. And what we've seen since the introduction of the Canada Health Act is progressive deterioration in our healthcare stats. We've seen escalation of costs to provide healthcare, and worsening of wait times, worsening of outcomes, et cetera. And so I think what we really need to say if we really want to improve healthcare is nobody ever thinks that we should ever go the path of the United States. It's a horrifying catastrophe. Universal healthcare is absolutely a necessity. Healthcare is a human right. It is not a thing that should ever even be toyed with, that anybody should ever not have guaranteed access to healthcare. But we have to acknowledge that the way that we do universal healthcare here in Canada is not something that's what defines us as Canadians. It hasn't been there forever. It's a bit of an experiment. We started this in 1984, and in fact, it's led to a lot of degradation of our healthcare system. And if we're going to fix that, we need to open our eyes, not to what's south of the border in the United States. We need to look and say, what's being done right in the UK, in France, in Sweden, in Australia, New Zealand. And that's how I think we're going to start to improve.
So that's interesting. The Canada and US were sort of locked in this embrace, looking only at the other and saying, I don't want what they've got. But doing that prevents us from actually looking at the rest of the world. Look at any of the social democratic countries in Europe. Look at, as you say, Australia, Japan, other places for better examples. Well, we're going to circle back because we've got a question from the audience about addressing the mental health crisis post-COVID, and maybe there's some technology options there. So I'll come back probably to you, Brad, and maybe to Tim. But first, I want to bring Dilip back into the conversation. Dilip, you're an expert in behavioral economics with teaching experience around the world, and you've got a special interest in solutions for the bottom of the pyramid. So coming back to COVID, when it first hit, there was a lot of talk about this V-shaped recovery. Were we going to bounce back really quickly, and how skinny might the V be? And more pessimistically, were we going to get stuck with a U-shaped recovery? So it was sort of a long trough at the bottom. Were we going to be in a W where we might come back, and then with a second wave of pandemic, would we have another economic shock and end up in a W shape? But now the talk is that we are at serious risk of a K-shaped recovery. And a K-shaped recovery is one where pre-existing inequalities like income inequality, and you've touched on that, are exacerbated by the pandemic, by the differential economic impacts that the economic shock occasioned by the pandemic is happening. So that those who are well off and recovered are doing increasingly well, and others are not, and that differential is getting wider and wider. So what techniques or policies does behavioral economics suggest would be effective in making the K? I'm going to stick with letters of the alphabet here, but making the K, I said more like an F, so that we don't have that sort of lower sloping, but maybe we should be aspiring even beyond an F to, I'll call it a P. So I'll say that's an F, but with more social mobility. So talk to us about what behavioral economics would recommend, and feel free to give us a recommendation for close to home, but maybe something also for emerging economies.
Sure. So you raised an interesting point. We haven't had one pandemic. There's two. And it's a completely different pandemic for the lower income people, both in Canada and elsewhere, versus those of us that are fortunate to be able to work from home, that are fortunate to have a car to go to wherever we want to go to, that are fortunate enough to have the income to have groceries delivered home. It's a completely different world. And so not only is the incidence of contracting the COVID-19 greater if you're lower income, but there's also lower bandwidth to deal with it. And so, for example, a lot of people who are struggling to go get tested or stay away from work or stay away from crowds. They don't have the choice. They're not doing it because they are stupid. They're not doing it because they don't understand the importance of staying away. They can't do it because every single day of work or income lost means that the family doesn't have food on the table. So I think we have to be very careful about that, right? I want to go back and sort of talk about briefly, I think a lot of the folks in this audience might have heard about a famous book in the behavioral econ domain written about 12 years ago called Nudge, by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And if you haven't heard about Nudge, I think you should go out and look at it. I want to actually talk about Nudge's evil cousin, sludge. Right. So what is sludge? Tim's an engineer. He knows exactly what sludge is. But we tend to think about all of our systems, be they healthcare or our social security systems, having universality because we make them open to all. Right. We don't discriminate between who can and who cannot get healthcare or who can and who cannot get welfare. But in fact, we do. And we do it at a very implicit way, right? And so imagine that there's a bunch of houses all over the town. They all have pipes connecting the house to the central water supply, but some of those pipes have sludge in them. So just because you have a pipe doesn't mean you're going to get the water, right? So, for example, many years ago we had a welfare program in this country called the Canada Learning Bond, $2,000 of money, quote unquote, free money to eligible low-income Canadians as long as they use it to educate their children. And I remember being in the room when this was announced, and one of the economists said, well, who wouldn't take up the $2,000 of free money? Well, it turns out 84% of people didn't. Right. And they didn't take it up, not because they didn't know about it or not because they weren't convinced that they needed to educate their children, but there were lots of sludge reasons. For example, you had to open a RESP account to get the Canada Learning Bond check. And to open the RESP, you needed a SIN number for your child. And to get a SIN number, you needed a birth certificate. And these were the days, of course, when we didn't have the birth bundle. And so if I was a low-income Canadian working 3 jobs to feed my kids, I wasn't going to have the time to do all of that, right? So that was a sludge. Or the fact that I had to go to a bank account to do it, and the bank shut at 6 p.m. was sludge. Or the fact that I came from a culture where I didn't want to be seen as receiving benefits, and you make me stand in a line where it is obvious when I speak to the teller that I'm here to open an account because of. So I think those are the kinds of things we need to worry about, right? So from a policy perspective, I think the evidence is very clear. The way you make things easy for low-income people is to give them cash. It's as simple as that, right? And the reason why cash helps, so cash transfer programs help, is that they reduce the cognitive burden on people, right? So now they're not thinking about, oh, gee, if I have to take a day off, what am I going to have to do to make sure my family gets food, right? And so I think we need to employ cash transfer programs. I'm not advocating for a universal basic income type program. Maybe it's time for us to think about research in that area as well. But cash transfer programs are fantastic because they reduce temporary frictions. And I think we need to do a lot more of that.
Yeah, reducing friction and reducing cost in the system and really encouraging better outcomes.
I mean, like just even paid sick leaves. I think, making sure most Canadians get paid sick leave is going to go a long way in solving many of our problems.
Yeah. Again, lots to think about there. As I said, we've got a lot of questions coming in from the audience. And so I'm just going to take them. I want to come to the one on mental health and COVID, and maybe I'll come back to you, Brett, because I will say that trying to focus on some positive things that have come out of this pandemic experience. I've never found it easier to get a prescription filled. To get a prescription from the doctor to get filled than in the COVID era. So is there something about virtual delivery of healthcare that would help us meet the ever increasing demand for mental health services? Can you help us understand that a bit?
For sure. So there's obviously been terrible things that have come as a result of the pandemic, especially with regard to mental health. If you look at the stats, we are seeing record numbers of people that are expressing difficulties with their mental health, record numbers of people who have contemplated self-harm, record numbers of people who are finding it difficult to work and remain employed due to their mental health. So all of these are huge challenges. This is, I think, a difficult time, even for the most resilient of us. That being said, I think one of the greatest things to come of this pandemic is I think it has forced us to embrace technologies and ways of providing care that would have taken decades to be embraced. So if you look at virtual care, which is obviously, what my main career is about these days, before the pandemic, if you looked at Canadians, only about 10% of Canadians surveyed had ever seen a healthcare professional by virtual care. Now, after the pandemic, if we look at the most recent stats, which are from a few months ago, and I imagine this number's a lot higher now than it even was at this point in time, you're looking at a stat that about 50% of Canadians now have spoken to a healthcare professional virtually. And that is incredibly important in that many of the barriers, especially around mental health care, are very much based around physical provision of care. So people with mental health problems, often they struggle to actually travel to appointments. They may not have a mental health practitioner that's geographically proximate to them. They don't like sitting in a waiting room. You can imagine if you are suffering from anxiety or depression, the thought of sitting in a waiting room for 2 to 3 hours for an appointment is something that could actually throw you into crisis, and nobody wants to deal with that. There's also a significant embarrassment issue around mental health. There are many people that the last thing they want to do if they need to see a psychologist or a therapist is be spotted in the waiting room or spotted walking into the office. So all of these disappear with virtual care. The really good news as well is that when you look at the research around the provision of mental health care by virtual care, all of the studies show that mental health care delivered by video is just as effective as in-person mental health care. So we are seeing rates of resolution that are excellent, but we're seeing accessibility that has gotten much, much, much better than it ever was. The other thing that I think is really important to note is that you actually remarked on this really effectively, is that you've never found it as easy to get a prescription as you might have found it before. And part of this is due to the fact that we underutilize healthcare providers in our systems. So if you look at physician stats, Statistics Canada says that only about 40 to 50% of Canada's doctors actually work fully or full time. There's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of it is just that they may have to travel to a place where they provide care, and it may only be convenient for them to do that 2 or 3 days a week. Some of them may take sabbaticals, they may actually go teach abroad, they may do a huge number of things that actually make them not able to work fully or full time. The beauty of virtual care is it now allows us to tap into all that unused capacity, and that is both among general practitioners, but also amongst practitioners of mental health care. And so the doctor who it's 8 p.m. and they're actually they have nothing to do in the evening because they're waiting for their family to come home or waiting for something else to happen, they can use that hour to see a few patients from home, and they never could have done that in the physical world. The physician, and we have many of these on Maple where I work, the physician who is doing a sabbatical to teach abroad, who now could provide, in the past world, could provide no healthcare to Canada. Now they're providing healthcare back to Canada, even while they're out of country. So there's this tremendous opportunity to harness unused capacity, tremendous opportunity to provide more convenient care, and all of this at the same time while preserving the safety and efficacy of care. So I think this is a huge opportunity for us to improve mental health care. And I think my belief is that we're going to hold on to a lot of those improvements even after the pandemic is done.
That would be great. If we can get fax machines out of doctors' offices, I, for one, will be really, really happy. It wasn't that long ago that I had to fax some information to my child's pediatrician. I'm like, fax machine? Fortunately, we have them at the office because we have to communicate with the Canada Revenue Agency, who also only communicates by fax and not by email. So I was able to get a fax off to my doctor's office, but perhaps we can accelerate past that, which would be great. I'm going to change gears now. Yuta, I want to come to you because I've had a really interesting question from the audience about animal welfare. And this, I think, touches on a lot of things. I mean, on the climate change front, there's a report today in the New York Times. There have been other reports in the past about how we need to change our food supply if we are going to effectively tackle climate change. It's not just fossil fuels, but also on the COVID front, I think that there's a realization that perhaps human encroachment into wild animal populations and treatment of animals that can be reservoirs for COVID is something that we need to tackle. And I think an increasing interest in doing so humanely. So can you talk about what, and I realize that this is a bit outside environmental law, but just help us understand sort of some of the thinking about animal welfare and the ways that legal frameworks can help us consider that.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I think you're right in flagging that there are all kinds of issues that come together here in terms of, you mentioned climate change and dietary changes, so long-term discussion already about the fact that we need to actually, come back to the idea of what we have to cut back on, eating meat or beef, because there are, tremendous emissions from cows, actually, methane emissions, and also land use patterns that are ultimately unsustainable. I mentioned earlier some of the tipping points that we're facing. So biological diversity, loss of species diversity, in part because of the encroachment that you mentioned is another big factor. So the way that law tries to tackle these issues is sometimes sideways, in the sense that the example about eating beef or cutting back on cattle ranching and so on would be one of the issues that you might tackle somehow through a climate change negotiation lens as one of the technical issues. Similarly, biodiversity, so you then conceive of the animal issue as a biodiversity issue and deal with that in a biodiversity framework. Sometimes that raises also the challenge of making sure that one doesn't conflict or undercut what the other does. So for example, again, giving you a climate example, climate policy has discovered forests and forest ecosystems as a potential carbon sink. They're also a place where biodiversity exists and can be preserved and protected. And some of the solutions that might work for climate, like planting forests, won't work for biodiversity protection and so on. But then the animal rights issue, and I cannot claim to be an expert here by any stretch, but that really tackles, so that actually puts the lens not on what we humans, how somehow our interests intersect with the animal issue. That actually goes a long way back. Some of the earliest environmental, what we would today call environmental agreements, were conservation agreements, wild animals in Africa, but it's because they were to be preserved for hunting or for enjoyment, or there were treaties on birds. Actually, the title was literally "Birds Useful to Man," because they were related to farming and so on. So the animal rights issue tries to actually say, let's look at this from the perspective of what we're looking to protect, and conceive of what rights animals have that then we need to respect. And again, if I draw a larger parallel to environmental law, that debate, there is a classic article in environmental law in the 1970s called "Should Trees Have Standing?" It was the same idea that one should give rights to nature so that nature can actually then have somebody speaking on its behalf in the courtroom, as opposed to funnel it all through concepts that somehow aren't actually meant for that purpose.
Well, interesting. An amicus brief for the forests, so to speak. That would be really, really interesting. So I've got an interesting question from the audience. I'm going to come to you, Dilip. It's about action at the organizational level. So we've talked this evening about creating incentives and opportunities for individuals, and we've talked about nation states. Bring us back to the level of the organization, which, very significant actors in our economy and in our society. And how do we create the right incentives, the right nudge environment for organizations to be part of the solution here?
So great question. I think the underlying belief is that organizations are motivated by financial reasons, right? So we give them a tax break and they'll comply with whatever it is they need to do to get a tax break. But there's a bigger thing that I think organizations care about, and that's reputation. And I think that's the one thing we need to focus on. So let's think about sort of this general area of, plastic usage and how do we reduce plastic usage across the world. And so obviously there's a lot of people spending a lot of time thinking about creative solutions to get I don't know, your local coffee shop to not offer straws or for you to not use lids. And I think that's great. But at the end of the day, it doesn't make a big dent in terms of plastic consumption. Like the big consumers of plastics are the corporates, right? And so imagine that we had some sort of a scoring system, some sort of a scorecard or an independent agency that rated every organization on how much plastic they use. Now, you could do this for plastic usage. We could do it for other kinds of problems, privacy policies, right? At this point in time, there is no independent assessment of how good somebody's privacy policies are, or whether they safeguard your data or not. Let's imagine somebody could do that, right? And if you could do that, and you could rate every website on sort of a little thermometer saying, okay, green, this website really does everything it can do to protect your data, versus red, it doesn't. It just creates an internal family of incentives, right? So purely from a game theory perspective, when one company does well on that, everybody else wants to do it, right? And so I think reputation is the one currency that we haven't really used well to sort of incentivize organizations to do things differently. I think at the end of the day, the organization is really like another entity. It's got goals, it's got aspirations, but unlike humans, it is not centrally attached to those goals and aspirations, right? So every person that works in the organization is essentially playing a role. And I think that's why it becomes doubly important for us to recognize that if it's something that's going to show up in the Q4 results eventually, it's something that the company will act on. And so I think money is one, but reputation is the other big currency that we need to work with.
That, by the way, is why the Global Weight Watchers has a good chance of working, because when there is publicity and accountability and transparency about what states are doing, it makes a big difference.
That's exactly the case, right? And so, I always imagine a system where, in fact, transparency has an effect on what the organization does to a greater degree than to what consumers do. So if you remember those, we have the restaurant hygiene cards in Toronto. So there was a study done in Los Angeles, similar system there, three levels. And it turns out that the evaluation found that a lot of restaurant patrons didn't actually even look at those cards in making decisions. They weren't looking at the cards and deciding, oh, this one is yellow, so maybe I shouldn't go. But the fact that the cards were posted essentially improved hygiene throughout the system, right? And I think that's the kind of stuff that we need to start exploiting more.
Yeah, I think we're making some progress in that with the adoption of ESG. But you're right, we need to get beyond sort of aspirational kinds of statements and into some, sort of harder metrics and scorecards, so that we can harness that power of reputation, as they say, to keep all of us honest. I will say I've been much more disciplined in my exercise regime when I get together with my best friend and go for a workout, because she's keeping me accountable, and I'm not able to just roll over and decide that I can do that workout. I can do that workout tomorrow. Tim, I want to come to you on AI, and it was Dilip that mentioned privacy and privacy policies. And so at the risk of being unfair and putting an engineer on the spot about sort of broader social implications, do you think that we are in a spot where our ability to innovate, our sheer kind of technical power and the advancement of knowledge in machine learning and in artificial intelligence is sort of outstripping our ability to manage that power responsibly? Can you just give us some reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It certainly has implications, beyond engineering and into a lot of fields. I think the pace of advancement in AI and ML in computing in general is just going so fast that I think we really do need to, as a society, focus on privacy. And the fact that we probably unbeknownst to ourselves are giving up data of all sorts every second of the day that we are surfing the internet, on our phone, right? You go to Amazon and you look for I don't know, a new laptop or a new computer monitor or something, and all of a sudden all of your browser ads on the side are the same thing, right? And you think, well, I've already bought a TV. I don't need another TV or another TV. But like these are the things that they're mining, right? They're mining that data. They're mining your usage patterns and feeding you that information. So I don't have a great answer here, but I certainly think that this is a really important area that we need to manage. And in order to innovate, I think responsibly, I think we have to take control of our data and make sure that it's being used for the right purposes to advance all of these technologies that are relying on our data.
And could I just jump in briefly here? I mean, I think there's an interesting behavioral lens on how to manage privacy as well. And so this comment was actually inspired by my teenage son 8 years ago when he was a teenager. He was sitting in the living room doing this on his tablet. And I said, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, you know, Dad, I've just downloaded this like new cool app, and this is everything I need to agree with before I can use it." Right? And I think about this framing in an interesting way, because if you're a behavioral scientist, that was precisely the worst time to deliver this message about privacy. I mean, here's this kid who spent 4 minutes of his precious life downloading an app that all of his friends are using. Impulsivity is at the highest, and then you make him read stuff. Like, you have no chance off the bat. And I think we need to start rethinking sort of how we deliver privacy messages, when we deliver them. The devil is in the detail. It's not in the message as much as in the detail. And so a simple timing change could actually have that effect.
Although that's probably somewhat deliberate too, right? When you get those terms of service agreements presented to you, they want you to quickly scroll through it so you can actually get to what you want to get to.
Of course, right? And I think that's where I think some sense of, some combination of regulation and behavioral interventions should help. But again, it's a long and complex topic, but I think it's something we need to think about. It's not just about whether people care or not. It's how and when. It's the devil is in the detail.
Yeah, how do we create the right framework to get the outcomes that we want? And Tim, you were right on the money, because we had a great question which you addressed there about circumstance in which we the humans are the product, right? So this data mining is going on, and it again kind of comes back to us though to be careful about the manner in which we're using technology and how much we're sharing. We're down to our last couple of minutes here, so I'm going to go to some questions that I'd asked for super brief answers. We've got one question from Paul Cadario. I'll go ahead and name him. Hi, Paul. Glad you could join us tonight. And it's directed to you, Jutta. What could we do to add urgency to the Paris Accord?
Actually, I think the urgency is being added. That's for a change good news. The fact that there's a new US administration coming in that is committed to the Paris Agreement is exactly that sort of signal and momentum setting that I mentioned. And you may have noticed, if you look at the Globe and Mail, the Canadian national newspapers, or CBC, there's already a lot of talk that has real implications for Canada, because we cannot now sort of lollygag anymore in the wake of the previous US, or still current US government, but that we now have to take climate action seriously. So I think it's this kind of momentum building, and then coupled with that, an idea that had been on the agenda when Paris was first negotiated and then shelved because of what happened in the United States, is to fortify this regime by individual countries adopting border measures, that is trade measures or tax adjustments, so that kind of free riding is harder. And if there are enough countries around the world doing that, I think that will also increase the pressure moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Jutta. I think I am going to make that last question from Paul. So Paul, thank you for that. We are just about into our last 90 seconds, which isn't quite enough time for me to do justice to the thank you that is owed to our panelists, because I think we've had a fantastic conversation this evening. Certainly, COVID has showed us that we can take disruptors and dilemmas into a virtual environment and reach many, many more in the audience than we would have done with in person. And also that we're able to take this across faculties and really showcase the breadth of expertise here at U of T. And now I'm going to put in a shameless plug for U of T, which is one of the top 20 universities in the world, one of the top 5, in fact, number 3 public universities in North America, which I think is just extraordinary. And it does that with the lowest per capita funding from any province for post-secondary education here in Ontario. So another reason that we need to reform healthcare funding and outcomes. Also that we can improve our investments in higher education, including in U of T. But again, thank you to our panelists. It's been such an interesting conversation. We could have gone on much longer. And thank you to you, our audience, to our U of T alumni. Please do join us for another Disruptors and Dilemmas event. Until then, stay well, stay in good health, and stay in good spirits. Good night.